All right, I start recorded.
Good afternoon, or morning, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Pietri Ferreira, and I'll be the moderator for this session. Before I introduce the speaker, just a couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, please make sure you're muted during the session. And if possible, please turn on your videos. We all know what it is like to teach to a blank screen, so turning on your videos would be great. Please, if you have any questions, raise your hands using the Zoom function or type in the chat box. I'll then call upon you. I think it's just a lot better if you ask your questions yourself, as we know that a lot can get lost in translation. And also important, please let's allow the first 5 minutes to be uninterrupted, and Chen will notify us when those 5 minutes has passed, and then the floor will be open for questions. So our presenter today is Chen. She's a fifth-year PhD student at Columbia Business School, and she will be on the job market this year. So as you all know, that's a very important fact to mention. So without further ado, here's Chen to present her paper, The Subscription Economy, Implications for Valuations and Earnings Management. Thanks, Chen.
Thank you, Petri. Hello, everyone. My name is Chen. I'm currently a job market candidate from Columbia Business School, as Petri has introduced. I'm very excited to present my paper here, as the accounting design project has always been a significant motivator for me to produce research that is relevant for practitioners. So this paper, The Subscription Economy, Implications for Valuation and Earnings Management, examines the characteristics of the subscription economy and how it affects the market's valuation approach and firms' earnings management incentives. This is my job market paper and also my first time presenting this paper outside of Columbia. So any questions, suggestions, or comments are highly welcomed. I will not be writing notes, but I know that this is recorded, so I will make sure to go back to the recording and then incorporate all your comments for the next revision. So start with a motivating example from my personal experience. Swimming is my biggest hobby. So a couple of months ago, I was looking for a smart swimming goggle that could help me improve my performance during the training. So after I found this one that satisfies my need, I find out that I can only purchase it with a so-called free 1-year membership. And after this 1 year, if I want to keep using my smart goggle, I have to keep subscribing to this software year over year. And this smart swimming goggle is just one example of subscriptions being everywhere in our life. Nowadays, from Spotify to Netflix, from Dropbox to Microsoft, subscriptions is everywhere in our life. Even if you don't swim properly, you have to drive, or you have to take a car wherever you want to go. Recently, while BMW just caused an outcry by introducing a subscription plan for the heated seats service, Mercedes soon follows and announce an acceleration increase service, which allows the subscribers to drive 5 to 10% faster than the non-subscribers. So we can clearly observe this trend, this emergence and the rapid growth of the subscription business model, or more precisely, the recurring revenue business model. This business model is defined as a business model wherein the vendor offers access to a product or service in return for a recurring fee collected at specific intervals. As estimated by UBS, the value of the subscription economy was $650 billion in 2020 and is expected to increase to $1.5 trillion in 2025. As we can see from this chart, so this chart plots the cumulative revenue growth of subscription business versus S&P 500 revenue growth from 2012 to 2022. The growth rate of the subscription economy largely surpasses that of the S&P 500. And as we can see from the example of Mercedes BMW, this business model is expanding from the IT industry to many other industries. Together with this rapid growth of subscription economy is the quiet change of the market's valuation approach and also firms' earnings management incentives. As the subscription business generates most of its revenue in the future rather than now, the market increasingly emphasizes the recurring portion of the revenue rather than the current reported revenue of subscription firms. Although there are a few non-GAAP informal measures that investors would use to evaluate the recurring portion of the revenue, on the balance sheet, deferred revenue is one of the closest proxy for this future recurring revenue. And with this increasing importance of deferred revenue on the balance sheet, the earnings management incentives of subscription firms have changed. While premature revenue recognition used to be a major concern of both regulators and academic researchers, there arises attention as to whether subscription firms would still engage in this behavior nowadays. So we know the advantage of engaging in this premature revenue recognition is that the firms can increase or inflate their revenues and hence the earnings of the current period. And the downside of this tactic is that the firms had to sacrifice their deferred revenue. It will naturally decrease. And considering that the market increasingly emphasizes the deferred revenue, it's unclear anymore whether this premature revenue recognition would bring these firms net benefits, or even on the contrary, they might engage in an opposite deferred revenue management, where they inflate the deferred revenue to enhance their valuation or to project a better future to their investors, even though doing so would decrease their current revenue or overall performance. As the practitioners observe, in the old days, the regulators wanted to make sure you weren't booking too much revenue upfront, but now they've completely flipped. And the class lawsuit against Oracle also demonstrates that it's not a mere theoretical issue, but it has already become a practical issue. In the class lawsuit against Oracle, Oracle is charged with inappropriately inflating their deferred revenue and therefore the recurring portion of the revenue. And how did they achieve that? So Oracle engaged in a tactic known as attached deals, where Oracle offers its on-premise customer a trial option to try their cloud business at a very low or even zero costs. However, when recognizing revenue, they book the majority of the revenue to the cloud business. While doing so will decrease their reported revenue because the revenue of cloud business needs to be recognized over time. It would increase its deferred revenue level and therefore the recurring portion of the revenue, which is at the heart of the valuation nowadays for firms such as Oracle. So now I come to my research question. The key research question of my paper is, do firms reliant on recurring revenue, hereafter I abbreviate it as recurring firms, do they exhibit distinct earnings management incentives? More specifically, is there a change in their incentives for premature revenue recognition? And even more, do we observe a new incentive that the literature has not documented before, which is the deferred revenue management, where the recurring firms deliberately inflate their deferred revenue to enhance their valuation? And then lastly, because these firms, according to all these assumptions, cannot inflate their revenue through premature revenue recognition as easy as before, will they turn to cutting even more discretionary expenses than before in order to still meet or beat their earnings benchmarks? And before answering these questions, to give an overview of the subscription economy to the audience, I will also examine what are the characteristics of recurring firms. And also, I examine how does the market evaluate the recurring firms differently. I examine the valuation implications as this is associated with why firms would experience a change in their earnings management incentives. I first examine whether they have greater multiples, and does the market react more strongly to the revenues or earnings surprises of the recurring firms? And more importantly, if the market does discount these earnings surprises when the future recurring revenue is low, do we see this ERC advantage, this greater market responses, be reversed if the future revenue indicator is at a low level? So now I think I'm done with the 5 minutes. I'm good to take any questions. Yes, I am.
Hi, Yue. I have 2 questions.
Sure.
The first question is related to your lower part of the research question. Is anything you documented here different or consistent with the existing persistent earnings literature? So that we learned that from whenever a company's earnings are very persistent, they usually have a greater multiples and a greater ERC. Is this part of your paper to try to replicate that literature by focusing on only the revenue line item?
So that's a good question. So the mechanism is in some sense consistent. So those firms, the these recurring firms, they generate greater market responses. And one of the most important mechanisms is exactly this more persistent, also more predictable revenue stream in the future. But I do this slightly different because I examine the firm's 10K to identify whether these firms engage in this subscription business or not. So in this sense, I can distinguish firms from a firm that, say, for example, Coca-Cola, whose revenue is very predictable because it's very successful, has a lot of recurring customers. But nevertheless, it does not have any subscription business, versus firms like Netflix or Spotify, who does generate this persistent earnings through their subscription business. But the underlying mechanism are similar. So the valuation advantage of these recurring firms are exactly arising from this more persistent revenue stream.
So guys, is the one subset of the recurring earnings or revenue that is specific to the subscription base, because you are able to identify those keywords from the Edgar filings that is actually subscription specific recurring revenue.
And
is
also,
that right?
Yes. And also there are like more advantage of this business model other than this persistent revenue, such as this greater margin, or from the marketing perspective, it's easier for them to acquire customer and retain customer. So this also plays a role in this greater ERC tests. So persistent earnings is one of the factors, and the other, like marketing or financial advantage of this business model, also play a role in these tests.
So I have my second question is that for your subscription-based revenue model, does the customer always have to pay upfront? So do you always need to see deferred revenue? What if there's a subscription model, but a customer receives services first, and then the cash flow actually coming later? Do you only focus on the deferred revenue type of the subscription model, or do you also care about other type of the service contract when the cash flow comes in later? Yeah,
that's a very good question. So I've also been trying to sorting out this problem. So in this paper, I focus on the deferred revenue for a couple of reasons. So first, I indeed talk to a lot of practitioners and also dive into the industry report. And turns out that this transaction model where the customers pays a certain portion of fee in front is very common in this subscription business. As we can see from the B2C market, less so, but it's still common that we can see sometimes if, for example, I subscribe to the Dropbox, Dropbox will give me a discount if I pay for a year in advance, or even more if I pay for 3 years in advance. And but this is more of the case in B2B market. So in the B2B market of subscription business, mostly this SaaS or PaaS or similar cloud business. In this business, it's like convention in the industry that the customers pays in advance for 2 or 3 years in advance, which will create the deferred revenue. But your concern is definitely valid. There must be some transactions that I cannot capture, where the fee or the payment comes after the service. And in this case, there is this order backlog thing. I didn't take the order backlog into account in this paper because order backlog is commingled with other incentives, such as the firm's inability to fulfill this order. And also, when I look into the data, order backlog has the majority of firms does not report this, especially in the recent years. And also, I manually check like 50 subscription firms, and a very limited number of them have reported order backlog. So I think that should not be a significant issue here. However, I do use like a new measure, like remaining performance obligation, which is arguably more closer to the future recurring revenue than deferred revenue. And then I cross-validate the measure by testing whether deferred revenue and the remaining performance obligation are strongly correlated. And I put this in the online appendix, and it turns out they're very strong. They're highly correlated. The disadvantage is that I cannot use the RPO, remaining performance obligation, as the main measure, because it's mandated after 2018. But I recognize this issue and I try my best to like incorporate this in my tests. Thank you. I think Chen.
I tried to turn on the video for some reason. Oh yeah, yeah. Aloha, yeah. Yeah, very interesting paper. I have some comments and some questions. My comment is, I think the subscription economy has been there for a long time. If you look at average consumer has an electricity bill, has maybe gas bill, and like the water and sewage bill, and sometimes the average consumer buy cable TV. So I think the subscription economy has been there for quite some time. Is it kind of like in terms of the industry compensation nowadays is different from before? And my second question is, what do you mean by firms reliant on recurring revenue? Do you mean by more than 50% or what's the cutoff?
Sure. So thank you for your questions. So in the first question, regarding those bills or like cable TV bill, yes, indeed, like this model has been there for quite a year, but like in the gas example, mainly those are constrained in a very limited number of industries. And only after this expanding of the IT technology, this business model is able to be transmitted to many other industries other than just like the cable TV or the gas industry or the like energy industry. So that's why I use like so in my paper I use this I use the cutoff of I use the sample period from 2010, so after the financial crisis, for two reasons. One, I want to avoid any negative impact of the financial crisis, and secondly, it's also because after I read a lot of like subscription economy or subscription business model paper and the industry report, it seems like the boom or this emergence, not emergence, but this rapid growth of the subscription economy happens right after around 2010 for the majority of the big companies, and that's why I use it. And for your second question is how do I cut off this recurring revenue recurring revenue variable? So that's also a very good question. In this paper, I did not use a dummy variable, rather I use a continuous variable. So I measure, I will talk more about this later. I basically measure how often firms talk about their recurring revenue in their 10K. So the underlying assumption is that the more firms operate on this recurring revenue business model, the more they will talk about this recurring revenue in their 10K. And the reason I do so is that even a firm adopt this recurring revenue, it's not that the firm would 100% adopt it. For example, Microsoft adopts Microsoft 365, but still is also selling some on-premise products. And that's why I think using a continuous one may be able to better capture this firm's continuous reliance on the recurring revenue business model. But I do have also used like a score. So I just use tercile of this recurring revenue occurrence count in the 10K, and then I put them into 3 buckets and then give them the score of 1, 2, 3, and the results are still consistent. So that's how I do with that. Thank you. Joshua?
Yes. Thank you for this, Yue. I'm just trying to test my understanding of what you said. I didn't read your paper, but I listened to what you said. So my understanding is that you're looking as to whether firms prefer manipulating or inflating current revenue versus inflating deferred revenue for sending a signal that there is significant recurring revenue in the future, hence getting better multiples. So it seems, and I don't know if you do that or not, it seems natural for you then to partition the firms on the dimension of incentives for increasing current revenue versus future revenue. So for example, if you partition firms on the meet and beat analyst consensus estimates, right? So those who have more tendency to meet or beat would be more short-term, and those who have less tendency to meet or beat would be long-term. So you'd expect the long-term to basically focus on increasing deferred revenue. Is that something you do or something you thought about?
I think that's a very good idea. So your summary of what I have in mind is perfect. That's exactly what I'm going to test. What I do in this paper is slightly different. What I did is indeed I partition firms based on their meet and beat incentives. That's exactly what I do. But what I test and also what I find is that so given that this bucket of firms are already in this meet and beat incentive bucket, I further partition them into the recurring firms versus non-recurring firms. And I find that they inflate different line items, or they manage different line items to get their to achieve their targets. So I find that for the recurring firms, they would turn to cutting more discretionary expenses because they do not want to sacrifice their deferred revenue. And they even defer even more. They even excessively defer more revenue, probably to enhance their valuation despite the very unsatisfactory performance. So this is what I find.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Tom.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I like this subject. My question is concentrated on the cutting expenses. I believe the value implication may be depending on the existing investment efficiency, right? For example, let's say you're cutting R&D or other intangible expenditures. And so if the firm, before the cutting, if the existing expenditure is over investment, right? So the cutting it further would be beneficial, right? In terms of value enhancement. However, if the existing level is already under investment, right? So a further cut will worsen the value creation, right? So so they have different value implications. And in the real world, we see both over and under investment exist, right?
Yes.
Over investment exists, for example, like empire building incentive by the manager, right? Under investment incentive, you know, right? You cited Stein, 1989, right? You know what I'm saying. So I'm wondering, maybe you could have generated a finer prediction on the combination of the measures used by the manager. You know, on the one hand, right, they want to postpone the revenue recognition. On the other hand, they also has the incentive to cut the current expenses, right? And yeah, so what's your thoughts on that? Okay.
I see your point. So I also recognize that at the very end of the paper, that one caveat is exactly in line as what you've said. One caveat of the paper is that I cannot distinguish whether this earnings management behavior is solely for like manipulative or like for the self-interest of the manager, or is actually also something that is optimal for the shareholder. That would be the case if in the case, as you said, they are already over-investing anyways, and maybe they cut it, which is also optimal for the shareholder value. So this issue kind of applies to many of the earnings management paper, because we cannot observe what is the optimal contracting behavior that the firm should make. But I think indeed I can carry out the test that you suggested. I can partition the firms into whether they have already been over-investing or not, and then see like what's the percentage or what's the dynamic between this over-investing and the cutting discretionary expenses behavior. I think that's
yes. So of course, I believe you must be aware of a lot of empirical literature mirroring the over versus under, right? So you are saying you are trying like Beadle, Hillary, and Verdi, right? So you know they measure the over and the under, right?
Yeah.
So you are saying you could, right, extend along those lines, and okay. So
yeah.
that's okay. Thank you.
Very good suggestion.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can we please move forward?
Of course. Sorry. So I'll give the preview of findings. So I find that in terms of their characteristics, I find that the recurring firms tend to be smaller, younger, they are more profitable, and consistent with their business model itself. They also exhibit greater revenue persistence. And as for the valuation implications, I find that the recurring firms have greater multiples and a greater earnings response coefficient compared to their industry peers. However, if the recurring firm in the same period reports a low level of deferred revenue, which is a proxy for their future revenue, this ERC advantage would be reversed. And these findings suggest that the market would put a more emphasis on the recurring nature of the revenue rather than what the firms claim their business model is. And so this finding also lays a foundation of why these recurring firms may experience a change in the earnings management incentives. So I find that to beat or beat earnings benchmarks, those recurring firms would excessively defer revenues to enhance their valuation, contrary to premature revenue recognition, which is suggested by prior literature. So this is a new earnings management incentive that is not documented by prior literature and is worth noting by especially regulators and standard setters. And consistent with that, they cannot simply inflate their revenue through premature revenue recognition. I find that they also cut more discretionary expenses to meet or beat their earnings benchmarks. So these are my main findings. I will briefly go through some institutional background. So these are the advantages of recurring revenue model. So why would people expect that there are different valuation implications for recurring firms? So they are different from a traditional business model in both financial and market perspective. From the financial perspective, they have more persistent revenue streams, which allows them for better long-term strategy development and allows for more efficient resource allocation. And from the market perspective, recurring business model is can easily acquire customers at lower costs, and also it's easier to retain customers. And especially, I guess, if everyone, so I guess no one in this room could probably 100% accurately track how many subscriptions we have through our phone, through our cable TV, or through our other like Amazon subscription. So this is one example of why these firms can easily retain customers. And also lastly, this business model allows for easy cross-selling and upselling opportunities. And all those advantages goes into the valuation implication of these firms. And more precisely, as Ayang just asked before, one of the most important mechanisms is this earnings persistence, which proxies for earnings quality. And also all this marketing perspective advantages maps into the future growth opportunity of the firm. So all these advantages of this business model together, we can see there is the emergence of this business model, the emergence and rapid growth, and we also see the high valuation of this SaaS companies or cloud companies currently on the market. So firstly, I ask, how does the market evaluate the recurring firms differently? However, the market does not simply give these firms a high valuation simply because the firm claims that I am running based on a subscription business model. Rather, the market or the investors will certainly look into the exact number to check whether you are really generating the revenue that is recurring in the future. So this is an excerpt of an analyst report issued by Credit Suisse for Microsoft. We can see in this analyst report that the analysts explicitly estimate how much of the revenues are recurring revenue and how much is changing year over year. So the valuation function is not only based on the claim of the business model itself, but rather on the hard number of how much of your revenue is going to be recurring. But we know that those recurring revenue is not disclosed anywhere. And even this recurring revenue that is estimated by analysts, they have to estimate this number based on some other measures. And one of these measures is deferred revenue. We can see this deferred revenue importance also from firms' recent financial reporting. So this is the first two paragraphs of Cisco's 10K in 2018. In the very first paragraph where they talk about their fiscal year 2018 performance, they say we continue to increase the amount of deferred revenue and the proportion of recurring revenue. And they also say we expect that we will increase the amount of our recurring revenue. And also for Adobe, the first thing that they say in their 2013 10K is about their subscription revenue. And as the third point, how much of their deferred revenue was in the respective year. So this valuation is based on the assumption of the revenue being recurring in nature rather than on the business model itself. So as the second question, I further examine would this market evaluation or this pricing function be reversed if the future revenue indicator, deferred revenue, is at a low level. And all these different valuation implications or all these different pricing functions would naturally map into a different earnings management incentive for recurring firms. As I explained before, while premature revenue recognition could help a firm to meet or beat earnings benchmark by inflating the revenue, it will give the firm a worsened future revenue prospect, for which the market places a greater weight for the recurring firms. So I further ask whether we observe a flipped circumstances in today's economy, and moreover, if these recurring firms cannot easily manage their revenue by by sacrificing the deferred revenue, do we observe they cut more discretionary expenses to meet or beat earnings benchmarks? So this is the overview of the test that I'm going to do. So to examine all these questions, I construct a measure of the reliance on recurring revenue business model, which is called percent recurring rev, by using natural language processing of 10K. So I count the occurrence of recurring in conjunction with the word revenues or sales within a 20-word window around it. For example, the case we see in the Cisco's case, this algorithm would capture the recurring revenue here and will also capture the recurring revenue in the second paragraph. And the assumption is that the more firms are reliant on the recurring revenue model, the more firms will talk about this recurring revenue in their 10K. And considering that the 10K is getting increasingly long in the past decade, I further scale this occurrence of recurring revenue by the total word count of the 10K. Yes, Ayang.
Hi, Yue. So like previously on your slides, you talk about a lot of studies as early as in the 80s. Researchers already have this notion of earnings persistence. And before the technology of the textual analysis, researchers tend to use some time series data, right? For example, the analyst example you gave us is just a year-to-year change. So I wondered how does your measure overlaps with just a simply year-to-year change in revenue to infer the recurring model? Because in the chat box, as Sudip had also talked about, like there are many industries already have this recurring revenue model in place, regardless whether they mention it in the SEC filings or not. So here the question is a little bit harsh, is that as the nuance of your paper is just introducing this new textual measure, or is actually conceptually there's something new beyond the earnings persistence concept? Is the new way to identify, or is actually a new idea you are introducing? Yeah.
That's a good question. So I think first, as I said earlier, this business model has certainly more advantage other than the persistence thing. And the second, besides that, this valuation approach of focusing on how much of the revenue is going to be recurring in the future also arises in the recent years or recent decade, after the technology allows for this kind of business model to be applied to many other industries. So in this paper, what is new is that I want to show that the underlying business model will change the market's pricing function, and therefore this will map into firms' different earnings management incentives. And also in my paper, like I did a test where I partitioned the years by earlier years in my period and then the later years in my sample period. I find that this phenomenon is stronger in the later years, so more stronger in the recent years than in the earlier years. This is consistent with the prediction that as the market increasingly noticed that as the investors increasingly focus on the recurring portion of the revenue, more and more firms realize that and then would cater their earnings management incentive to the market's valuation approach. So I think this is the new part besides the earnings persistence. Earnings persistence has always been valued, always been appreciated by the market. But more now is that firms cares about, that the market cares about it, has evolved many specific metrics to just measure it. And then in response to that, how firms react to this in recent years. So, yeah. Okay, if there's no other questions, I'll move forward. And as suggested by Joshua, I have 4 earnings benchmarks to partition firms with and without earnings management incentives. These are followed by a survey evidence of Ko et al. And these are the earnings guidance, analyst consensus, and last period's earning. And my results are largely consistent across all the different benchmarks. To measure the earnings management behavior, I estimate abnormal discretionary expenses and abnormal deferred revenue, abnormal accounts receivable to capture firms' earnings management behavior. And lastly, I also have manually collected a metric which is called annual recurring revenue. This is a non-GAAP measure, which is defined as the annualized value of the recurring portion of the revenue. And although I cannot utilize this ARR, so this ARR is by definition highly correlated with how much revenue is going to be recurring in the future of the firm. But unfortunately, I cannot use it as a main measure because it's a voluntarily disclosed measure and have only a few number of disclosures, even in the recent years. But nevertheless, I hand collect them and then cross-validate whether it's strongly correlated with my main measure. Yes, Subida.
So during the pandemic,
Yes.
gym memberships, which are also subscription-based, right? So for a big disruption, like 55% of members, gym members, either canceled or paused the membership. So the question is this really as stable as you're projecting, or is it, during a recession or during a business cycle type event, are they most vulnerable than businesses that don't have this kind of model? Because it's sort of perhaps too focused on a particular kind of customer and they're not diversified across customer types. And so they may be more susceptible. So just a question.
Yeah, that's a good question. So my paper cannot directly speak to this because I cut off the sample period up until 2019 to avoid the COVID effect. But I do have read the industry report of the subscription economy. And indeed, after the pandemic ended, the number of the subscribers dropped sharply. But in the reports I used, in the report I read, actually the growth rate. So even after this customers went away, this growth rate of the cloud business is still much higher than the other industries. And also, they are still much higher than the pre-pandemic pandemic level. And the overall number of the users also increased compared to the pre-pandemic level. So certainly during the pandemic, there is, to me, some mispricing of this cloud business or of this subscription business. We see like they surged crazily high and then dropped quite sharply after 2021. It's partly because customers are leaving. It's also partly because of the increasing interest rate, which would naturally harm the valuation of this business. But overall, I think for now we cannot say whether they are like more fragile or not than the traditional business, because even compared to the pre-pandemic time, they are not really performing worse. But yeah, my paper cannot speak to that due to data limitation.
So my example was a B2C. Do you think B2B is more stable than B2C? Would that be a way to sort of get at what you're trying to show? Because the earlier research has mainly been on B2C.
Yeah, that's I think that's a good suggestion. So for now I didn't do it for B2B versus B2C, but in mind I would conjecture that the stickiness of business relation is stronger in the B2B than in the B2C market. So for sure, I can look into how this partition would work and what's the implications. Thank you so much. This is a descriptive statistics. This is the occurrence of the recurring revenue in the 10K without being scaled by the total word of 10K. And this is my main measure, which is the occurrence of recurring revenue in 10K divided by the total word count of 10K. Now we can see that there is an increasing trend in both of the plots over from 2010 to 2019, which is consistent with the subscription economy expanding in the past 10 years. However, the slope is steeper in panel A, possibly also partially driven by the increasing length of 10K. So in my paper, I use the scaled measure to control for this effect. I also rank the industries by the average number of my key measure recurring revenue. And the top 5 industries are information, professional services, administrative services, real estate rental and leasing, and manufacturing of computer and electronic product. So this is highly consistent with that firms in these industries are most likely to offer the product or services on a recurring basis. So this further validates my measure. I also carry out 2 other validation tests to show that my measure is positively correlated with current deferred revenue, also long-term deferred revenue, and also the deferred revenue, total deferred revenue of the firm. And this is based on the assumption that this recurring business usually have a higher percentage of deferred revenue than their industry peers who do not operate on an operating basis, on a recurring basis. And lastly, I also use the ARR measure I just discussed, which is the annualized value of recurring revenue, and cross-validate whether my main measure, recurring rev, is positively correlated with firm's propensity of disclosing this metric and the size of this metric. And I find that my measure is strongly positively correlated with both the propensity of disclosing ARR and also the size of ARR. So this gives some confidence that my measure correctly captures the recurring revenue size or recurring revenue reliance of the firm. So after validating the measure, I turn to investigate what's the characteristics of these firms. I find that they are generally, they show like lower revenue volatility. So it's like 3 years after adopting this, they show like lower revenue volatility, and they are less inclined to be the over-investing firm. I also find that they're smaller, they're more profitable, and younger, and also they are growth firm as measured by market-to-book ratio. And because I show that the recurring firms are fundamentally different from the non-recurring firms, I also use the entropy balance in my paper to control for these firm fundamentals. Turning to valuation implications, I find that my recurring revenue reliance measure is strongly positively correlated with both the implied revenue multiples and the implied EBITDA multiples of the firm. Yes, Patrick.
I was unsure if I should call upon myself, but I waited for you to call upon me. Okay. So is this recurring percentage revenue, do you think it is something different from revenue persistence, or is it a proxy for revenue persistence? Because if it is something unique, it's probably important to control for it. And if it's a proxy for it, then it's probably important to specify why it's a better proxy than just using the persistence of revenue in answering this question.
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. So to me, I would say we have already seen that they are highly like negatively correlated. I didn't control for it because the revenue persistence is something that naturally would arise from this business model. So I would expect that this business model is like an umbrella term under which earnings persistence is one important characteristics that this business model brought. So this is the same as I answered to Ayang. They are like highly correlated, but in my conjecture, this business model brings more than this. It also brings like different valuation implications, also different marketing perspective advantages. So more than that. Yes.
I have a quick question.
Yes, please.
it would be helpful if you said something about economic significance aside from the stargazing. Right now, we're looking at stars. In my eyes, the T statistics looks very low given the sample size, and that's okay. But it would be helpful if you could tell us that given your various dependent variables, which ones are really important on the right-hand side, and then you turn to the extent to which the key variables are really important. And if you could do that in terms of so-called economic significance, that many people would find that helpful.
I see. Okay, yeah, I will mark this.
Yeah, I mean, then again, we're not going to keep quiet. If you do economic significance the way people do it in general, you could probably rest assured that you will find economic significance per data analysis, because that's what everybody finds. But what you want to keep in mind is that the reviewers often nowadays demand that you say something about economic significance.
Yeah, I see. For sure, I should have had it. Yeah, I will.
No, it's okay. I'm just telling you, it's not what I think that counts. Reviewers tend to care about this.
Yeah, that's a very good thing. Thank you. I will know that. Thank you. Joshua.
Question.
Yes. So I'm sorry. So I am a little bit confused in the following sense. Are you suggesting that firms are inflating deferred revenue and they're doing that profitably because the market is being deceived? What if an analyst or a sophisticated investor analyzes the quality of earnings, and current earnings are presumably deflated if I inflate deferred revenue? If I deflate current earnings, then the quality of the current earnings would decline because it would not be as predictive of future earnings or cash flows. So what's going on? The market is not looking at the current earning quality, and it's looking only on the deferred revenue, and hence it's being deceived if the firm specifically manipulates deferred revenue.
Yeah, that's like a good question regarding how efficient the market actually is in detecting this earnings management behavior. So my take in this question is, so this is what I find, right? Like when the recurring firms have stronger incentive to meet or beat the earnings benchmark, they report a positive abnormal deferred revenue, which shows that they excessively defer revenue to like give a better impression for the future. What I would like, why like that correlates with why I think it's an important research question to look at, exactly because this earnings management incentive has not been documented by other literature and also has not been a concern of the regulators. As I read from all those SEC commissioners talk, they have been repeatedly talk about the premature revenue recognition, and this like opposite behavior has barely been mentioned by the regulators to the public. So one implication I draw from this is it's arguably a new earnings management incentive that people should be looking at. That's probably not something that analysts or sophisticated investors have been allocating resources to look into. And also later, I have an additional test where I show that even so, if I further interacted with greater analyst following, then this revenue deferral incentive actually is exaggerated, possibly due to even greater earnings management incentives.
Yeah, but am I right in assuming or understanding that inflating deferred revenue would deflate current earnings? And deflated current earnings would be less able to predict future earnings. So are you suggesting that investors or analysts don't look at the quality of current earnings in the sense of being able to predict future earnings, because that quality would deteriorate? So there is sort of an offsetting factor here. Offsetting the inflation of future revenue is the deflation of current earnings. And that deflation decreases the quality of current earnings. Are you suggesting that analysts and investors are missing that?
So if I understand it correctly, let me know if I didn't. I also show that in my understanding, you are basically asking whether they deflate their earnings and therefore making their earnings less persistent, which proxies for a worse earnings quality. And I do find that they still would meet this earnings benchmark by excessively engaging in other kind of earnings management, such as cutting discretionary expenses. So it's not that they just simply deflate their earnings and do not care how much my earnings is as long as I keep my deferred revenue at a certain level, but they just it's like a different preference in manipulating the items. So they would choose to go for cutting expenses side rather than focusing on inflating the revenue to get to their final goal.
Okay.
Thank you. Sudipta?
Sorry, I just want a question about your meet or beat test. Is your meet or beat proxy like an indicator for an interval? Okay, so this model is misspecified. So you should take a look at my paper with Dmitry Baizilov in JEE in 2019, which shows you how to do Bergstahl and Ditchev type tests in a continuous framework.
Oh, okay.
So this one is clearly misspecified.
Oh, okay. I will. Okay, I will look into that, like the JEE paper. So I have already like shown this, like the major test of my paper, like where the firms change their earnings management incentive, or the recurring firms have different earnings management incentive when they are close to meet or beat earnings benchmarks. So basically, I show that the recurring firms are not more likely to prematurely recognize revenue when they are close to earnings benchmarks. And on the contrary, they even report greater abnormal deferred revenue to meet the earnings benchmarks. And but still, they still have this incentive to meet or beat earnings benchmark. So what I show is that they cut even more discretionary expenses to meet the earnings targets. So it's basically like a selection or an pecking order of different earnings management incentives that recurring firms would opt for. And also I have briefly shown that. So I further interacted. So in this test, I want to examine whether the existing market forces is effective in detecting this earnings management behavior. So I further interacted with the analyst following, and I show that if with a greater analyst following, this abnormal discretionary expenses cutting behavior can be deterred because the abnormal discretionary expenses actually increase by a small margin. But the firm's excessive deferral of deferred revenue cannot be deterred and even is exaggerated with a greater analyst following. And possibly because of the greater valuation pressure due to the greater analyst following, as in the case of Oracle. Yes, so this test show that the current market forces may not be effective in disciplining this behavior. And I also have carried out a robustness test, which is an M&A test. So in this M&A test, I compare firms that acquire a recurring firm versus firms that require a non-recurring firm, and then compare the differential, or their change in the earnings management incentives before and after the acquisition. So I still find the consistent evidence in the discretionary expenses part, but not a significant result for the deferred revenue. But here possibly also because of the power issue, because there are only a few firms during my sample period have acquired a recurring firms. But nevertheless, there is no like negative significant results showing that the premature revenue recognition may not be as significant in today's economy or in today's subscription economy as suggested by earlier literature. So the conclusion is that the firms relying on the recurring revenue model generate a stronger market responses to earnings surprises, but only when the deferred revenue level is high. And I also showed that they are not more likely to prematurely recognize revenue, as suggested by prior literature, when they are close to earnings benchmarks. I showed that the opposite that they excessively defer revenue to boost the valuation, and they actually turn to cutting more discretionary expenses to achieve this end. And in my additional analysis, I showed that the regulatory forces may be needed to discipline this recurring firm's deferred revenue management, exactly because this deferred revenue management behavior is not documented by literature, and it has not drawn the attention of the regulators. So it's important to raise the attention of the market that this kind of new earnings management incentive does exist on the market. This is also the contribution of this paper to the practice. So for the regulators, I show that there should be a shift of focus from premature revenue recognition to excessive deferral for recurring firms. So if the regulators are still looking after these recurring firms and they are looking for the evidence of they have prematurely recognized their revenue, our regulators may not find anything there because this is not their major earnings management incentives anymore. And also I would suggest the regulators to consider maybe disclosing or unifying the definition of the recurring portion of the revenue. So during this study, I have read many firms' transcripts of their conference call or the 10K. They have, so the recurring firms use many different kinds of non-GAAP measures for the recurring revenue, but firms usually use very different definitions for the recurring revenue, which could mislead the market and the investors. And to investors, I inform them about which earnings management issue they should direct their attention to, thereby reducing their information integration costs. And as to the contribution to the literature, this paper contributes to earnings quality and earnings management literature by showing the impact of the business model on the earnings management incentives. Especially, I show there is a new earnings management behavior where firms inflate the deferred revenue to enhance their valuation. And it also contributes to literature examining why the earnings quality changes over time. This paper shows that the earnings management incentives changes with the evolving underlying economy. And therefore, if the underlying economy is changing, then the earnings quality measures should be changing together with this new earnings quality concerns. And if this earnings quality measure remain invariant over time, then it's not possible to capture this the real change of the earnings quality. So now I'm done with my presentation. I will also briefly promote the next week's ADP presentation. Next week, it will be on Monday, not a Tuesday event. Our presenter will be Robert Hughes from Penn State University, and he will present his paper, Accounting Information and Disaggregated Credit Risk. And the registration link remains the same as the earlier links. So I'm looking forward to next week's presentation, and I will also stay for any other comments or suggestions that you like to make. Thank you so much for all your comments. They're very helpful.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chen.